All right, continuing on with interest groups. In fact, this is our second part. We'll have 3 cards on it, and then we're actually done with interest groups. All right, now interest groups. We have some problems with their influence. There are some issues. We have already talked about how they influence the iron triangles and in the legislative process. But look, what are some issues that happen with interest groups? 5.23. All right. So first off, their influence is impacted by a couple different things. Influence is impacted by one, inequality of political and economic resources. So their influence is impacted by number one, inequality of political and economic resources. Well, and that's just a funky way of saying, or that each interest group is not created equal. Some have a lot more influence than others. That might be a good thing. That might be a bad thing. Interest groups also can have a very partisan nature to them, and so certain interest groups have a lot more money, and so therefore they have a lot more influence on policy, both bureaucratically and in the legislature. Check this out. These are some environmental groups, and these are all interest groups that give to political parties. You can see where they give party money to, which party they give money to. And first off, notice that the League of Conservation of Voters gave almost $3 million to candidates, and 98.9% of that went to Democrats. So overwhelmingly, if you look down at this list, most of them, except for Clear Path Action, most of them in Clear Path Action had almost $8,000 to candidates. It wasn't much, but most of them give to the Democrat Party. So environmental groups, not surprisingly, when you consider ideology, give overwhelmingly to Democrats. But then look at the amount of money that these other groups have. So now we see, look at oil and gas. They had 21 million, so quite a bit more than the environmental groups, and 83% of that money went to Republicans. Commercial banks, 20 million, 64% went to Republicans. National Education Association and the American Federation of Teachers, which are the 2 largest teacher unions, and they have a lot of money. They $20 million each. They gave 98% and 100% to Democrats. And then Microsoft, you can see, is mostly Democrat, and Amazon.com is 2/3 gave to Democrats. So, interest groups usually have some sort of partisan bent, and the amount of money they have, it just depends, and so therefore some interest groups have a lot more influence than others. That can be good if what the policy that they're following is actually for the public good, but sometimes the interest is just for themselves, and it doesn't necessarily help society at large, and that's why a lot of criticisms of interest groups as a result. There's an unequal access to decision makers. So newer interest groups, not as long-standing interest groups, maybe interest groups with not as much money to give to campaigns, they might not have an iron triangle relationship. So unequal access to decision makers. Whereas the bigger interest groups that have a lot of money, interest groups that have been around a long time, they may have a lot of access to bureaucratic decision makers who are making rules and to legislators. Also, third and lastly, there is something known as a free rider problem. A free rider problem. Let's define free rider. You need to know that. And what it is a free rider is a person who doesn't join the group, doesn't join the interest group, like pay some sort of fee or membership fee, but still benefits from its lobbying. The kind of classic example of a free rider would be a person who works at a company and they're not part of the union, but they get to benefit from the union's negotiation of wages. That could be an example of a freeloader. But in this case, it's someone who doesn't join the group but still benefits from the lobbying. Let me give you some examples of that. You don't have to write these examples, but make sure you have this. If you don't have this, pause but then watch the examples I'm about to give. All right, so here's an example. Don't have to write it. You support gun rights, but you don't join the National Rifle Association, but you benefit from their lobbying. That's an example of being a free rider. You don't join the NAACP, but you benefit from their lobbying in court cases that advance equality for minorities. Okay. You don't join the AARP, but you benefit from them successfully drafting and getting a bill passed to add prescription benefits for Medicare. So if you're benefiting from the Medicare thing, then the idea is that you should join the American Association for Retired Persons rather than just ignoring it. If you're going to, National Association for Advancement of Colored People is helping you because with equality, because of the court cases, then you should join it. That's the idea. So if you're a free rider, it means you benefit, but you don't actually join. All right. 5.24. How interest groups influence public policy. Trying to be specific. This has got a little bit of a lot. It's got a lot to it. So let's go through it. How interest groups influence public policy. Pause if you need to. All right. 1, we kind of already went over this, but they are experts in their area. They bring information and science to the issue. Data. Experts in the issue in their area. They bring info and science to the issue. You can see some groups here. You get the different groups on either side. NARAL is for abortion rights. National Right to Life, of course, is against. National Rifle Association is very pro-gun. And then Coalition to Stop Gun Violence is much more for restricting gun rights. And to make a point about those groups, there's competition. There's competition between the groups to influence policy. They're trying to influence the bureaucracy, the legislature, elections. All of that is part of what these interest groups are trying to do. Now, let's go a little deeper when we talk about the competition between groups. So let's just be clear about the type of groups that are competing. It could be just general interest groups like I just showed you, or specific interest groups like I just showed you. Or it could be interest groups like we just looked at. Professional organizations can count as interest groups. So what do we mean by professional organizations? Like groups of doctors, American Medical Association, groups of lawyers, the American Bar Association, and then teachers like the National Education Association. So it's not just like your one issue interest group like NARAL, National Abortion Rights Action League, or National Rifle Association. They're the kind of one issue interest groups. It could be professional organizations like doctors, teachers, or lawyers. Other things I want to add in. Ready? All right, so let's continue on with your list here after teachers. The military. The military is kind of its own interest group. They lobby for new weapons, new things for the military members. Social organizations like the Alzheimer's Association or Mothers Against Drunk Driving. Could be just some sort of social organization. Bureaucratic agencies end up becoming like kind of its own interest group. Trying to get funding for the EPA. So all of these types of groups, interest groups, single issue interest groups, or professional organizations, military, social organizations, bureaucracies, they all compete to do what? Ready? This is the last part of that. They compete to influence policy like the federal budget at key stages of the process. They all are trying to get their piece of the pie, for good or bad. And that's the debate that people have. And being part of an interest group gives you a lot more influence over things like the budget than if you're just a citizen, going about your business and working every day and you're not really involved in an interest group. Okay, cool. When we talk about the key stages of the process, what process are we talking about? We're talking about how a bill becomes a law, how the budget gets passed. Let me just highlight a couple of those things. If you want to write these down, you can. Drafting the legislation, that's a huge part. That's early in the process, obviously, and we already know that interest groups draft legislation. 2, testifying at committee hearings, using their expertise on a topic is a way that a lobbyist for a interest group is going to have influence. Matter of fact, look at the picture down below. Google had a lobbyist go in front of committee hearing to kind of talk about whatever issues Google was having, technology issue. And then also, once the bill has been written and finalized and is out of committee and it is sent to the floor, then there's lobbying that happens during the debate and vote stages. These are the key stages where all those different interest groups may be having influence on the process. And we're not even talking about the process that happens once it goes to the bureaucracy and the bureaucracy starts passing rules. Then there's a whole nother, iron triangle relationship happening. All right, awesome. That's interest groups. A lot of stuff there. Practice. Use your whiteboard. Go from there. Thanks, guys.